So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Ali Reza, and today I'm going to present my CVPR 2019 work. It's a joint work between Communication and Wireless Network Lab and the Center for Research in Computer Vision, CRCV. Okay, let's start with the problem definition. The problem definition is pretty straightforward. We want to select K representative samples from M available data points, and of course, number of the selected samples are a lot less than the number of available data points. And we want to preserve the structure, and the structure is defined in many different ways and leading to many different data selection algorithms and many different applications. So the applications that I'm going to discuss in this presentation are active learning, dataset summarization, and video summarization. There are also a lot of more other applications to data selection algorithms. So the main challenge of data selection algorithm is the computational complexity. Since the community is going toward very large data sets, we want the data selection algorithm to be able to generate results in some tractable time. And we want the data selection algorithm to be robust to outliers, meaning that if you add non-representative or outlier samples to your data set, we want the data selection algorithm to be robust to this perturbation. And also we want the algorithm be as general as possible, meaning that you should be able to apply it to different data sets and different applications without much effort and without much tweaking. So let's start with the intuition behind our method. So let's say we have a data set of faces, and you want to select the best 3 vectors that can span all the data points, meaning that you can represent all the data points as a linear combination of just 3 vectors. And it is known that ion faces actually do that. So if you select the ion faces, these 3 ion faces can represent the data points very accurately. But the problem with ion faces is that they are not within the data points, so they do not belong to your data set. There are some arbitrary vectors in your space. And also calculating all the singular vectors of a data set is very computationally expensive. So we extend this intuition and design our data selection algorithm such that it selects according to the spectrum, which is the singular vectors. So this is the visualization of how our algorithm works. So let's assume that you have 4 data points in this space, and you want to select only one sample. What we do is that we calculate the first singular vector and find the most correlated sample with it, and we select this sample. Then in the next step, we project all the other samples onto the null space of that one selected sample, meaning that we subtract the component which can be represented by that single sample. And then in this residual space, we can perform another cycle of selection, and we repeat this cycle until we have enough samples. And so what does this mean mathematically? So let's assume that you have this matrix A, and this matrix contains m data points, and each of the data points are n-dimensional. So you have this matrix, and it is m by n matrix. So we want to select a subset of samples, and this subset contains only k of the samples, and we want to project all the data points onto the subspace spanned by these samples. And we want to minimize the projection error, meaning that this projection should be as close as possible to the original matrix. So this is the problem that we are solving. So this problem can be reformulated as a k-rank factorization problem. And we have here a matrix V, and we have this constraint that each of the columns in matrix V should belong to this set A, and this set A contains the normalized data points. So we have the data points, we normalize them and put them in set A. And we want to reconstruct matrix A as a linear combination of k of these normalized data points. So this problem is exactly the same as this as the main problem that we wanted to solve. So, but still this problem, it is difficult to solve, so we kind of relaxed it. Let's assume we just want to select one sample, and what would be that sample? We further relax this constraint here, so instead of belonging to this set, we want to find the best unit norm vector that can represent the matrix A. And this is by definition the first right singular vector of matrix A. And this is what we do. Then to kind of enforce this constraint again, we find the most correlated sample with that vector, and we select that as our selected sample. Then in the next step, we do the null space projection. Then in that residual space, we perform the same steps again. We have shown that our algorithm has many desirable features. The first one being the linear complexity. In general, calculating all the singular vectors are very computationally expensive, but since we are just calculating the first singular vector, it can be shown that you can do it in linear time. And because for each selected sample, we are just calculating the first singular vector, we can do the selection in linear time. Then we have also shown that our algorithm is robust to noise, because it can be shown that if you add outlier samples or noisy samples to your matrix, that the first singular vector is the last singular vector to change. And because we are using the first singular vector as the guide, so the output of our selection algorithm will not change much if you add outliers. Also, we have shown that there exists at least one sample which is highly correlated with your singular vector. So this means that now that we are using the singular vector as the guide, and we have a highly correlated sample with it, so and because the singular vector is not changing much after adding outliers, so the outcome of our selection algorithm also will not change after adding outliers. So let's move on to the experiments. So here I will explain 3 different applications. I use UCF101 for active learning. For the second task, I use CMU multi-phase data set and ImageNet for learning using representatives. I also have some experiments on video summarization using UT egocentric data set. So active learning tries to address the costly data labeling problem, meaning that we want to label as few as data as possible. So for that, this is how active learning works. So we start with a very small labeled data set. We train our model, then run all the unlabeled data points through our model and extract some uncertainty score or feature vectors. And we use those features and uncertainty score and a selection algorithm to select a few unlabeled data points. Then we only label those selected data points and add them to our training data set, and we repeat this cycle until we have a very good accuracy, or the accuracy which is required. So for this, we use a UCF101 data set, which is a video data set and contains 101 human action classes. And we use a ResNet 3D architecture, which is pre-trained on kinetics. And for the feature space, we perform the selection on the feature space produced by the last convolutional layer of the network. So we start by training the network on only one sample per class. Then we add, on average, one sample per class in each cycle. So this is the results for using just random selection, and these are different selection methods and one active learning method which uses just uncertainty. So you can see that any selection method can help, but in active learning methods which use uncertainty to select the samples, because in the first few cycles the model is only trained on like a 1 or 2 samples, the uncertainty score that you extract from the model is not reliable, so you cannot use it as a selection. And you can see that here, that using uncertainty is giving you just as good as a result as random. But after a few cycles, the uncertainty becomes the best method to select the samples. But if you use our proposed algorithm, you can see that even at the first cycle, we can get a very good improvement over other methods. And we can also incorporate uncertainty in our selection method. So instead of just selecting the samples that are very correlated with the singular vector, we can select the samples that are correlated with the singular vectors and we are uncertain about. So in that way, we get the best results. And for comparison, for example, if you want to get an accuracy of 77%, using IPM and uncertainty, you can get that accuracy using 6 samples per class. But the closest competitor is the uncertainty method. And for that, you need 9 samples per class. And it shows like about 33% reduction in the labeling cost, which is huge in many applications. And so these are some qualitative results. So here are the first selected samples by IPM and another state-of-the-art selection method. So this is for class clean and jerk. And we can argue that this first selected representative by IPM is a better representative compared to the representative selected by this other selection algorithm because the action is more visible, the scene is less cluttered, and features of the action such as the barbell is a lot more visible in this selected representative. Another interesting example is the class kayaking. So again, the human performing the action is a lot more visible. The kayak, the paddle is a lot more visible compared to the selected representative by DS3, which the action is kind of happening in the background. And to see why a good selection can result in a good classification, we performed this experiment. So this is a 2D visualization of just 2 of the classes of UCF 101. And so what we have here for each class, we have about like 100 samples. Each of the points are representing 1 video clip. And the contours here are representing the decision boundaries learned by an SVM classifier. So our goal is that we want to select just a few samples. And if the SVM trained on those few samples reproduces these contours, it means that those samples that we selected contain enough information to do the classification task. So for using, after selecting only 2 samples using different methods, you can see that the decision boundaries by this class is very similar. And if we select 5 samples, decision boundaries for both of the classes are very even more similar. And if you compare it with other 2 methods, you can see the difference and how similar is that is the decision boundaries learned by IPM. And for 10 samples, the decision boundaries are almost the same. And if you use just these 10 samples, you can probably get a very close accuracy as using the full data set. So this shows how a good selection algorithm can lead to a good classification. And for the second task is learning using representative. So this is different from the previous task. So here, the main difference is that we have a huge data set and we have the labels, but we want to summarize the data set and we want to select a few representatives from each class and perform the learning task using only the representative. And if the samples contain enough information, the accuracy would be very similar to using the full data set, and it will save us a lot of computation and a lot of storage. So for the first set of experiments, I'm using multiply-phase data set. There are 249 subjects and 9 poses, 20 illuminations, and 2 exposures. So we have about 360 images per subject. For the feature space, we use PCA to project the images onto a lower dimensional space, which is a 200-dimensional space. So for the learning task, we chose a generative adversarial network. So this generative adversarial network, if you give it an input, a face input with any pose, it will generate all the views of the same face, of the same identity. So we trained this scan on the reduced training data set, meaning just 9 images per subject, and we have 9 views here. And also on the full data set, which is 360 images per subject. So To compare the results, we perform this quantitative investigation. We try to measure the identity similarities between the real and generated images. For that, we extracted the features of the generated and the real images using a ResNet model, and the model is trained on MSCeleb data set. So the thinking is that if the feature vectors are very close in that feature space, they probably belong to the same identity. So in other words, the distances of the feature vectors correspond to the phase dissimilarities. So we want them to be as small as possible for the same identity. So this is the results for using the full data set. And if we select 9 images per subject using different algorithms, you can see that, again, IPM has the closest results to the full data set, meaning that the identities are very well learned using the selected samples by IPM. And the reason behind this can be seen in the representatives selected by different methods. So these are the representatives for one subject selected by k-methods. You can see that some of the poses are repetitive. This is the same for DS3. But if you use IPM for selection, you can see that the samples are a lot more diverse and contain a lot more information about that subject. This can be explained in more details using this figure. So here the samples selected by IPM are shown in green, and you can see that they are distributed fairly uniformly among all the views. But k-methods and DS3 are missing some of the views and selecting more than one sample for some of other views. So this leads to performance deterioration that we saw in the previous slide. So we also performed this task on ImageNet. So ImageNet, as you know, it has 1,000 classes, and each class has around 1,000 images. So, and for the feature space, we used non-parametric instance discrimination to create a feature space, and it is an unsupervised method. So our feature space does not contain any label information. And also because of the size of the data set, DS3 failed to generate any results. And just IPM and k-method were able to generate results in tractable time. And so let's assume we want to select only 5 samples from for each class. These are for class Siberian Husky. These are the selected samples by IPM and k-method. And we can argue that these are better representatives for this class because the object of interest is bigger in all of the images, and the scene is less cluttered, and they do not contain objects from other classes like other dogs and humans. Another interesting example is the class screwdriver. Again, the samples selected by k-method contain other objects, and the object of interest is less visible. But the samples selected by IPM contain only screwdriver and different types of screwdrivers. So if you give a classifier only these samples, they contain a lot more information about that specific class. But one might ask that the samples selected by k-methods are more diverse, so they cover the space better. To answer that questions, we try to classify all the images in the testing set using only the selected samples using the k-nearest neighbor classifier. So we just selected a few samples and try to find and for each testing sample, try to find the k-nearest neighbor in the selected samples. So these are the results if you just select randomly, like 1 sample per class or 5 samples per class. And if you use k-method, yeah, you can see a huge improvement. But if you use IPM, IPM can beat k-methods and up to like 8% here. And this shows that the selected samples by IPM are both better representative and cover the space better. For the last set of experiments, we have video summarization. So the goal of video summarization is to select the key clips and then stitch them together to create a video summary. And we want the summary to contain the most essential contents of the video. So for example, you have a 4-hour video and you want to just select 24 5-second clips. So you want them to be distributed fairly uniformly and contain contain information about different settings and different parts of the video. So to show you so we use the UT egocentric data set for this task. For the feature space, we used GoogleNet pre-trained on ImageNet and extracted 124-dimensional feature vectors. Then, so we had we segmented the video into 5-second clips, and for each 5-second clip, we extracted a feature vector, then clustered the feature vectors, and performed the selection to select the clips, and then stitch them together to create a video summary. To show you the results, we used Rouge's U metric. And again, among the selection methods, IPM is doing pretty good. But to give you some context about these numbers, these are the results for supervised methods. So these supervised methods use some additional information, such as reference video summaries, to learn how to summarize the videos. And you can see that IPM is doing pretty good even among the supervised method, and is the closest competitor to the state-of-the-art supervised method. And so to conclude, we proposed a new selection algorithm called Iterative Projection and Matching. And the main feature of the algorithm is the linear complexity, which makes it able to generate results in tractable time for very large data sets such as ImageNet. And also we have shown theoretically that it is robust to outliers and noisy samples. And it has no parameters for fine-tuning, so you can use it for any data set and any applications without much tweaking and much effort. And also we have shown the effectiveness of our selection algorithm in many different computer vision applications. Thank you.
Very good.